While King Charles of the Stewart dynasty was understood as the Black Boy, that's a name that was given to him by his mother based upon his skin color and his eye color. He was understood as the Black Boy, but he was also understood as the King of the Cabal. Before we go any further, we're just going to look at these depictions of King Charles II. And what we've done here is taken away the hair so that you can focus on the phenotype specifically. Sometimes the hair might have been a wig. We don't really know because they were wearing wigs back then. But there's also a possibility that that hair was his hair. It's unclear. But what we have here is the facial features with the hair taken away so that you can clearly see the eyes, the shape of the eyes. You can also see a bit of scleral show. You can see the bulging of the eyes, which is a part of that Hanover type of phenotype. And then you also see the size of the nose. And of course, you see the protruding jaw, which we've talked about that before. And you also see some of these characteristics in a number of people today. So you can see this phenotype has made its way into present time. So it's a very dominant phenotype. And he has a few things going on there. But you have, of course, seen these phenotypes among various groups of people. We've talked about the Scots being descended from the ancient Egyptians and them taking on this identity based upon Queen Scotia. However, there is another identity that is tied to a number of these kingdoms in Europe, these ancient kingdoms. And so there are entities that identify these connected ancient kingdoms as the dispersed tribes of Israel. So those 10 dispersed tribes. And so this is coming from Abraham, coming down through that line of Isaac, and then going on down into Jacob. And so there is a belief by many people, not just based upon phenotype, but many people believe that these kingdoms, this Stewart dynasty, in fact, was a representation of this, what's called the Northern Kingdom. And so when we look at this, I want you to keep that in mind because there are a number of dynamics that are going on here. Now, this, of course, is in contrast to the identity tied to ancient Egypt, but it may not be in contrast. It might be that there is a conflation of these identities, and we've looked at some of those conflations before. But we're going to see very clearly what is being asserted with respect to Charles, King Charles, and this identity as the king of the Cabal, a Kabbalist. That's what he is, or that's what he was. And here you can see the names of the northern tribes. And so you have Asher and Dan and Ephraim and Gad and Issachar, Manasseh, Naphtali, and Reuben, Simeon, and Zebulun. What's interesting about this, and these two are highlighted, is that certain individuals are asserting that Gad and Reuben are actually the indigenous people of the Americas, specifically North America, so in the United States. There is this assertion that these people, the American Indians, in other words, are comprised of Gad and Reuben. Now, there can be a number of reasons for this taking place. One reason for this taking place, and this is a great possibility, is the attempt to superimpose this identity onto a colonized entity. Because these 10 northern tribes, according to these assertions that they are the descendants of Abraham, they are the major colonizers of the Americas and also the entire west coast of Africa and a number of other places. And so by doing this, it takes away that colonizer dynamic and situates them as the actual owners of the land of America. So it's a very interesting dynamic going on here. But there's nothing to prove that prior to colonization, this entity known as Gad or this entity known as Reuben was in the Americas operating as the American Indians. And so it's also very interesting because the 10 tribes are supposed to be in Europe, but simultaneously running America. And so these are the names, and so you can keep that in mind. You might have even seen that 12 tribes chart. What that 12 tribes chart does, inadvertently, is it actually ties the colonizer entities to specific tribes that you see on the screen. And so you have a number of places in the Americas where there is the claim that these various tribes are located. But where these various tribes are purportedly located, these are also the places where major colonization took place and where you don't see the indigenous people anymore, but you see these people that they are asserting are of these 10 tribes. And so before digging into this whole CABAL thing with respect to Charles II, what we have here is some information, some background information about these inns that are called the Black Boy Inns. But they are also affiliated with restaurants in the UK. And so it indicates here they are talking about the history of these pubs. Pubs across England called the Black Boy are generally named after King Charles II. It was a nickname coined by his mother because of the darkness of his skin and his eyes. And we've talked about the phenotype of King Charles before. Much earlier, a few years ago, we went in depth about that. It also indicates that King Charles is credited with popularizing champagne drinking and yachting in England. He was known as a big spender. Now, many people are familiar with a CABAL, and they are also familiar with the fact that CABAL is related to or growing out of this construct of Kabbalah. And Kabbalah, in terms of etymology, in terms of meaning, traces to this construct of to receive or to accept. This is also related to that group that we were talking about, the builders and Ptah and the pyramids and all of that. And so this idea of accepting something, accepting knowledge, esoteric information. And so it's related to that. But it's also important to note here that this is from rabbinical Hebrew, the Kabbalah, and it's spelled a couple of ways. You have this K, and of course you have that Q interchange and the C interchange. But another thing I want to make note of is where it indicates rabbinical. That's a word that is steeped in betacism. And so you can switch out that B for that V, and what you have is Ravi, and that equals the sun. Now, we've seen this before when we've looked at the work talking about these names related to Shem throughout the world. And so you see this constant relationship between Shem and the sun. And so this is no exception. And here we have those letter interchanges again, with it spelled with the C versus the K this time. It indicates that Kabbalah is a noun. It is a Jewish mystic philosophy coming out of the 1520s. We're not completely sure that that's how late this came about, but we'll go with this for now. In the medieval Latin, it was Kabbalah with this C versus the K. In one form of the Hebrew, we have it with the Q, meaning reception, received lore, tradition, particularly tradition of mystical interpretation of the Old Testament. And so this is a philosophical way of looking at this. We're going to look at the meaning of this construct, not just mystically, but in practical terms. And so it's also related to this construct of to admit, okay? And so you see that there's a similarity in terms of the spelling of this word in the Hebrew and the Arabic and the Latin. So you see all of these similarities. So you see also this Q with the Arabic. This is similar to the Quran where you see the K and then sometimes you see the Q. And so there's also an understanding that this Kabbalah language is about any secret or esoteric science. Now we get to the basic definition of CABAL. Now, interestingly, and probably no surprise, CABAL is tied to the word set. And so you see down below where you see the similarities, the synonyms, and you see set. And so the CABAL is the set. Britannica goes on to indicate that a cabal is a private organization or party engaged in secret intrigues and also the intrigues themselves. And so this is a construct that came out of the 17th century, again, completely related to King Charles. It was to describe any secret or extra legal counsel of the king. Keep this in mind, a cabal is related to the king and King Charles specifically, the Stewart dynasty specifically, the purported 10 northern tribes specifically. Okay, and so this is in relation to what's known as the Privy Council. And so there were these ministers also that were involved. And sometimes you'll hear this narrative that cabal is really using the first letters of all of the names of these ministers, and that's how they came up with cabal. But that is not how they came up with cabal. Cabal means exactly what cabal means. It's not an abbreviation of anything. Now, there's an offering that this whole thing fell apart in 1672. But if you've got some secret intrigues going on and a secret private organization going on, we don't really know when it came into being or when it actually ended, if it ever actually ended. So not only was King Charles into all of these intrigues, he was also understood as a very Machiavellian in terms of his approach. And so you see this author here indicating that this cabal was a politically important group and that this word cabal is coming out of the Jewish word Kabbalah. Now, this author is insinuating that whole thing about the cabal is taking the name from these five key ministers, hence, cabal is capitalized. However, that is not accurate. You can't have both of those things going on unless they were very strategic in selecting these officers in order to spell out cabal. I wouldn't put anything past these people. But at any rate, there are a number of offerings with respect to where this construct of cabal came from. But what we do know is that it is related to this idea of ruling secretly. Another interesting notation related to the Stewart dynasty is that there were individuals inside of this dynasty that were referred to as the pretenders. Now, typically, people think of the pretenders as these individuals who were illegitimately holding the throne. But there's another way of looking at a pretender. A pretender is someone who is just essentially faking. And so we have a number of constructs that are related to this idea of the cabal that are associated with this idea of faking. And this is consistent with the whole dynamic related to Jacob and Esau. Now we have this historical narrative related to Cabal and Kabbalah and Kabbalah and King Charles. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Bible and see what the Bible is saying about this entity known as the Cabal. Yes, the Cabal is actually in Scripture, and it's in there a number of times, and you can see the root of it, you can see the etymology, you can see what grows out of it. And so at 6901, we see Cabal. And in this instance, again, meaning to receive or take. What we're going to look at is what exactly does that mean, this idea of being a receiver or the taker. And here, going on into the etymology of this construct, we see this cabal means to choose, take hold, receive, undertake, coming from this primitive root that means to admit. In other words, to take, again, either literally or figuratively, to hold something, to receive something. And if you look down below, you can see a number of forms and transliterations with respect to this construct of cabal. What's also interesting is that this word is very similar to a word or a name of this entity in the book of Enoch that is spelled in terms of the last part of it, Kobel. And here you can see that phonetic spelling that I was just mentioning with that Kobel related to the book of Enoch. What we also have here with King Charles is this idea of the cabal, meaning something in front, a military siege engine. This is interesting because if you recall, the Royal African Company and a number of these companies that were chartered under the Stewart dynasty. So, in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, we have the Stewart dynasty right out front. Okay, so they are not behind. And it's also important to keep in mind that the Stuarts are related to a number of kingdoms around Europe. These are not isolated entities. They were, for the most part, related. So these monarchs were very much related to each other. And not only were they related to each other, they were related to monarchs in Africa. Central West Africa, West Africa. They were so related that they served as godparents for each other's children. So, anyway, we have this vanguard. That's what is being described here. So, a cabal is similar to the vanguard. That's what's being described with this something in front, a military siege engine. And when you think about how the colonizations took place, there was a vanguard that went first and started the entire colonization process. Often, apparently, based upon engaging in intrigues with respect to the native population. So much so that the vanguard often took the identities of the indigenous people and then gave the indigenous people other identities. And now we see, consistent with this deity set, that cabal is another word for war. Yes, war. And so if you recall, Set is the god of war. And you see this god of war identity throughout, various cultures. But Seth or Set is definitely the god of war, and cabal is another word for war. This idea of confronting, this idea of a battering ram. And this is done in order to receive something, in order to take. So the taking and receiving was a part of war, so the spoils of war, the colonization that took place around the world, essentially, and involved war. So cabal and war are synonymous. This only gets worse, it doesn't get any better. And so you see this root of cabal, meaning to rob. Okay, this is at Strong's 6906. Continuing on, we see that cabal is another way of saying to rob something, to spoil something, to cover, to defraud. Okay, so cabal is another word for trickster. And so we've got this entity that's understood as a war entity, a trickster entity, a robber entity, all rolled into one. And here at 6908, we have this cabal construct again related to gather, to collect, to assemble. Now, of course, this is associated with Charles creating this assembly or bringing things together, but collecting and gathering can also have other meanings. Gathering is also another word for harvesting and reaping. The most intriguing part of the cabal, if you will, is that it is an anagram. And you might have noted that the letters were the same throughout all of these words, these etymologies that we were looking at. But the word cabal is an anagram for something that's very interesting and tied to this identity that has been given to these kingdoms in Europe by a number of people. And so the cabal is not only the cabal, this gathering entity, this taking entity, this receiving entity, this battering ram, this war entity, it's actually associated to one of the Abrahamic names. And some of you have probably already guessed it. And here you can see the anagram on the screen. And so you can see how the letters are just moved around. But it's the same construct, even though these letters are moved around, which is what's really interesting. So you have an anagram that actually has the same meaning no matter how those letters are moved around. And so what's the anagram for cabal? Hmm. It would be a son of Isaac and also his descendants. And so when you look on the screen, you can see the cabal, the word for cabal in the Hebrew or in the Yiddish, and you can also see the word Jacob. And you can see that these are anagrams for each other and ultimately also having similar meanings. And here you can see it even more closely. I'm going to make it larger so that you can definitely see the connection and how these two constructs are anagrams. But you can also, based upon our analysis, see that these are anagrams, but they are essentially the same word. And here the letters are pulled out, so you don't have all of that extraneous stuff going around it. And you can see now very clearly how the letters are the same. This is the same as the name Jacob. And so Charles and the Jacobites are associated with this cabal or this cabal or this Kabbalah. And you can also see that this name, again, is an anagram of Jacob. You can also see, looking at the screen, Charles's features a little bit more clearly so that you can see a little bit more clearly the association between these identities that have been given to these kingdoms, these northern kingdoms in Europe, and this phenotype that's being represented here. Now, there are a number of phenotypes that have been represented, but this is a very unique phenotype. It's unique, however, it's also a very familiar phenotype. It's a phenotype that most of you have seen before in current times. And here you can see the translation for this Akob and this Cabal. And you can see that up at the top you see Akab, and down below you see Kobah. And you can see how the letters are simply interchanged. And so this idea of the king of the cabal has multiple meanings, but these meanings are all intertwined. And so you can't really disentangle them. There is an essence that is running through this construct of the cabal, that's running through this identity of the Jacobite, which, if you're looking at the Hebrew pronunciation of that, it would be Jacobi or Jacobi or Jacovi. Okay. And so that's what you're really looking at when they are asserting this identity of Jacobites. This may or may not be consistent with this identity of being descendants of Queen Scotia. There's so much nefarious activity going on with respect to these ancestral narratives, these historical narratives. It's very difficult to know exactly what is going on or what was going on. There is a lot of identity appropriation going on. There is a lot of superimposition of identities going on. There's a lot of colonizing going on, a lot of taking of things that don't belong to people, and also denying people their own ancestries, their own histories, along with taking all of their material possessions. This isn't just for the Americas. This is also in Africa. This is in India. This is other parts of Asia. So this is a sort of a universal, sort of global dynamic that's going on, and also done under the guise of these various identities. And so sometimes things were done under the guise of Rome. However, the various parts of Western Europe were benefiting from the things that were going on with respect to Rome. Even when there was the reconquering, the individuals who were reconquered basically went out and engaged in colonizing other entities. And what you'll see, though, sometimes is that those individuals who believe themselves descended from these individuals will identify themselves as victims. However, sometimes the way that colonization works is by sending forth these quote unquote victims to settle the land, to populate the land, to displace the original people. And that's what took place with respect to Spain, Portugal, and also Western Europe. And this heavy patrilineal focus in terms of this Jacobi or Jacovi identity, this 10 northern tribes identity, that heavy patrilineal focus, I'm not talking about patriarchal, I'm talking about lineage, that heavy patrilineal focus might have played significantly into the dispossession of these indigenous groups around the world because by and large, many of these groups were matrilineal.